Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com, and today we have another hand from that $10,000 buy-in tournament that I played at the World Series of Poker. Not the main event, this was a six-handed side event, which is usually a very tough field. That said, I'm still going to raise the 8-7 suited every single time from the hijack seat. There are rare instances where everyone's just very good and overly loose and overly aggressive where you may opt to fold this hand, but 8-7 suited is good. I'm going to raise it pretty much every time. A tight aggressive player calls on from the cutoff. This is the same player from last week's video who had the pocket aces against my ace king. Make sure you go back and watch that if you have not. You can find it on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/floattheturn. So he just called, which means he probably doesn't have aces. Small blind and big blind both call. It's kind of a bummer. I guess it's a bummer. You don't really mind seeing a heads up or a very multi-way pot with 8-7 of spades, which is why it's a good hand. But you're not going to win the pot nearly as often, clearly, whenever it's very multi-way. But, winning the pot's not the goal. Very often the goal is to win the most equity. And if you win the most equity, you will win all the money in the long run. Do not be obsessed with winning pots or winning sessions. A lot of cash game players pride themselves on winning 90% of their sessions. But you dig in a little deeper and their winning sessions are 20 big blinds and their losing sessions are 400 big blinds, and, well, that's not going to work out so well for you, right? So anyway, here we flop a pair and a flush draw, 10-7-4, 2 spades. Should we check or should we bet? If this was a heads-up pot, I would very likely check. This is a hand that can very easily check, call, check, call, check, call with a very clear marginal made hand. And whenever you make a flush or trips on the river, you have a very disguised hand. So I like checking here a lot when it's heads up. Usually when you have a marginal made hand and a draw, the marginal made hand portion of your hand, the value of that, often overrides the draw. And it's really nice to have some draws in your checking range because your opponent's not going to suspect that as much. And the best draws to check are ones that can call down with no problem, which is exactly this hand. So heads up, I would check. But multi-way, now there's a lot more merit in protection. Or betting for protection. Whenever you are playing heads up, you only have to worry about some small number of overcards beating you. Like, let's say our opponent had a queen jack in their hand. I only have to worry about queens and jacks on the turn that are not spades, so I'm really not worried about much, right? But if I'm against three opponents, one who has ace 10, one who has king jack, well, not ace 10, ace 9, let's say king jack and pocket sixes, well, now I have to worry about a bunch of cards, and I don't really know which ones I have to worry about. So I'd rather bet and clean up my equity, get those players to fold. And, if we pick up the pot, whatever, it's not the end of the world. So we do bet relatively small. We bet about half pot. This is a situation where you don't want to go too incredibly large, because if you bet too big, now you may only get called by a 10 or better. We want to make sure we bet an amount that can get called by a lot of marginal stuff that may fold if we keep betting on various runouts. And we also want to make sure that our opponent can still call with junkier draws, like say he has 6-5, well, I really want him in the pot because he's drawing very thin, right? So we bet 2,800, only cutoff calls, turns a 5 of spades, which is great. So we have a flush. Given we think our opponent's range to call our flop bet was pretty wide, that means he probably has a relatively wide range containing lots of junky draws, lots of top pairs, lots of, flush draws, which would be very bad for me. And notice all the good ones are still available. But in this scenario, we are trying to get called mostly when we bet again by a 10 and junky draws. So how much will a 10 call? Well, probably about half pot, give or take. Maybe a little bit more. How much will a hand like 6-5 call? Probably about half pot, maybe a little bit more. So in this scenario, I think a bet of about 6,500 would be pretty nice. That's going to get called by lots of inferior hands, which is great, right? If we do bet and get raised, I am not going to fold. A lot of people think that, oh man, if I bet the turn and get raised, they must have a flush. But I definitely do not think that is the case, especially against good players. Now, if you're playing against players who are very weak, very tight, and very straightforward, then, that may actually be the case. I know there's this idea that you bet with everything you have that is anywhere near value related until you get raised, in which case you fold everything. That's what you do in small stakes games to succeed. And while that may work there, it definitely doesn't work in the high stakes games. This is one of the best hands we can have. We are not folding this. So we bet 5K. I would have preferred a little bit bigger. And the opponent now calls, which is great. He probably just has a 10 or 6-5 or something like that. River's a 3. So now do we value bet again? Think about it for a second. What are we trying to get called by? We're trying to get called by top pair type hands. Maybe a hand like pocket 9s. Maybe a hand like 8-7 of diamonds that decided to be sticky. Maybe a hand like 7-6 of diamonds that, turned the straight draw that just got there with a straight. This is a situation where, in reality, though, I really don't want to be betting that often because I have no 6s in my range, and my opponent could have some. I do have some flushes, but at the same time, if you think about the likely range of a tight, aggressive player who, in the cutoff, who called my preflop raise, he probably just has mostly 10s at this point, right? It's not like this opponent was in the big blind, and he has all sorts of random 6s, like 6-5 or 10-6, right? That's not what we're against. We're against a player who probably just has a 10 here. So knowing he likely just has a 10 or pocket 9s or maybe a hand like pocket 8s, but probably not. If he does have one of those hands, how much should we bet? And I think as long as we don't go too big, we're probably going to get hero called. If you do think your opponent will fold every 10 to a bet on the river, you probably want to consider checking to give him every opportunity to bluff with a hand like 9-8 that he could have, or maybe he decides to turn a hand. I'm trying to even think what he could possibly have. Like maybe he has Jack 9 that got really optimistic with Jack of Spades somehow, but that doesn't make sense, right? He's not going to call preflop with Jack of Spades, 9 of Hearts. So the issue with this spot is I think if our opponent is on the tighter side and on the more cautious side, he's just not going to bet the river very often if we check. And if he does bet the river, it's going to be with a 6 or a flush. And if he does have a 6 or a flush, well, we're going to get money in when we bet anyway. So I think we need to bet to try to get called by the marginal made hand. So pot's 21,000. I think a bet of about 9,000 has a pretty good chance of getting called by a 10 or maybe a random 2 pair that somehow got there, like 5-4 or something like that. So I do go 11,000. I think this is probably a little bit too big. In general, when I'm value betting, I try to figure out how much my opponent will likely call. Like let's say I think he's going to call 11,500, let's just pretend. And then I go a little bit less. If I think when I'm bluffing, though, I kind of do the opposite. I try to think, all right, how much will he probably fold to? Let's say 11,500. Well, I'm not going to go a little bit more to try to ensure it, right? That's what I'm going to be doing as an exploitative strategy against some players. Anyway, here we go, 11,500, and I think this is a little bit too big. Sometimes when you bet a little bit too big, though, you will get called. But imagine the opponent will call 9,000, but he'll fold to 11,500 with a 10. Well, clearly, this would be a horrible bet, right? And betting 9,000, I think, kind of ensures we get called, whereas betting 11,500 maybe lets him get off the hook sometimes. Anyway, he does call. He has the ace-10 with the ace of spades. We got lucky a spade didn't come. If a spade did come on the river, I would have likely check called, by the way. I'm not just check folding on the river. I think a lot of people get themselves in trouble when the board is a 4 flush. They just think, oh, well, my opponent has it if he bets. But that's not true. A lot of people, especially good players in $10,000 six-handed World Series events, probably know they need to bluff whenever they don't have much on those boards. So should the opponent have called on this river? It's actually dicey. Because really, if I'm betting, remember, I went bet, bet, bet into multiple people. I probably have something pretty good, but he probably doesn't think I'm going to bet an overpair on the river. Therefore, I'm likely either bluffing or I have a very good hand. But it's kind of hard for me to have a very good hand when I open from this spot. He does block the ace-high flushes, but notice he also blocks the obvious ace-high bluffs, right? So it's a cool spot. I'm not exactly sure what the opponent's supposed to do here, but it certainly is not a great spot for him to be in. Anyway, we win the pot. That's nice. And we continue chipping up. That's going to be it for today. I want to thank you again for being here. If you're enjoying Poker News, let them know. Go tell them on Twitter @PokerNews. Let them know that you enjoy my videos. I've been making these every week now for, goodness, about 3 years or so. If you missed out on any of those 150 or however many episodes, you can find them all on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/floattheturn. Go there, subscribe. I also post a weekly podcast. I post a daily morning show. And I post all sorts of videos there. Video blogs, I post lots. So check that out. Let me know what you think. Good luck in your games. And I'll be there next week with another hand for PokerNews.com.